We're just delighted to have you here, Todd, to speak to us tonight about Alberta's evolving economy in a COVID world. There's not much more apropos than that, especially after we heard the Premier's announcement a little bit earlier this afternoon. So welcome. We look forward to your presentation this evening.
Well, thank you so much, President Agri, for that very kind introduction, and thank you to Birmingham University and the Business School for inviting me to speak as part of your speaker series. Now, I can't tell you how much I would love to be with you in Lacombe this evening. Lacombe, I have to confess, is one of my favorite towns or cities in the province. I've been to every single town and city in Alberta. Some more charming than others, I have to admit, but Lacombe I always have a real soft spot for because it is just such a beautiful, charming community, and Birmingham University, obviously a big part of that. So I wish we could all be together in the same room tonight. Unfortunately, it is 2020, and we can't be, so we do the best we can, but I thank you for asking me to be part of this webinar this evening. Now, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I get really good at this after a while. Can someone give me a verbal thumbs up that you see the big purple screen?
Yep, you're good.
Looks good? All right, thank you. The title of my presentation this evening, What If It's Easier Than We Think? Alberta's Evolving Economy in a COVID World. Now that title is meant to be a bit provocative, this idea of it being easier than we think. Because I think you'd agree, certainly nothing about 2020 has been easy. Maybe particularly here in Alberta. We see so many families that are struggling, individuals, towns and communities, businesses. It has been an extremely challenging and difficult year, and nothing has been easy. But this title is meant to be a little bit provocative. It's meant to get you curious, wondering what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to come back to this idea of evolving being easier than we think. I'm going to come back to that in the second part of my presentation. I want to spend the first half of the presentation talking about our current economic outlook for the province. I'm not going to take you through all of the numbers in our report, which we released a little bit more than a month ago. If you're interested in the full report, and by the way, it's only 2 pages, so we try really hard to make things concise. But if you're interested in looking at the 2-page report, which has more of the data, you can go to atb.com/economics and look there for Alberta Economic Outlook. But I'm going to share with you just a couple of the headline numbers coming out of our most recent forecast. We are forecasting Alberta's economy to contract 7.1% this year. Now, at this point in the pandemic, this shouldn't come as a shock or a surprise to anybody. I remember back in March and April, when we first started talking about, the magnitude of the contraction, it was a little bit startling for people to see numbers this large, because certainly 7.1, and I don't like to quibble over tenths of percentages, but if it's going to be 7 or 8 or 9, whatever, certainly 2020 is going to be the single greatest contraction that this province has ever seen. You really would have to go back to the 1930s to find something comparable, but we don't have comparable data from back then. More recent history, this will be worse than anything in the 1980s. Many of you on the call tonight will remember the 1980s. This will be worse than 2009, which before this year, 2009 held the record of the single greatest year of contraction. That during the global financial crisis. 2020 is going to be an even sharper recession than even 2015 and 2016 combined. And everyone on the call will remember those 2 years. So not a lot of encouraging news for this year. And the obvious reason is the pandemic, the forced closure of so many businesses, the shutdown that we saw earlier in the year, the partial shutdowns and restrictions that we're seeing now. It's been a difficult time. But it isn't too early to start talking about 2021. We are now only about 5 weeks away from it, if we can believe that. And I think, like most of us, if December 31st of this year, when we are doing our physically distanced New Year's Eve parties and we're singing Auld Lang Syne, I don't think any of us will be too sad, really, to see 2020 behind us, and we can start to look forward to 2021. At this point, our forecast, we are calling for a modest expansion of 3.3%. Now, that is good news in the fact that it's at least a positive expansion, but we have to keep in mind, even if we see 3.3%, that doesn't even get us halfway out of the hole that we've dug this year in terms of the contraction. In fact, by our estimates, it might take Alberta to 2023 until the economy returns to the size that it was pre-COVID. In other words, January, February of this year. So we've got a long way to go crawling out of that hole, but we do think we will start to see some expansion next year. Now, that 3.3% expansion, it comes with a few caveats and a few conditions that have to fall into place. One is that in 2021, we don't see maybe a third wave of the pandemic forcing another closure of the economy. There are no guarantees. I mean, this pandemic has been so unpredictable because it's new. Scientists have had a hard time projecting exactly what's going to happen. So we don't know. But at this point, we are assuming that this second wave of the virus that we're in at the moment, that we're not going to see this repeat again and again in 2021. And in fact, we haven't baked this into our forecast yet, but there are, encouraging signs around the vaccine showing up at some point in 2021, and then we can finally start to move past the COVID pandemic. So that's the first condition, is that we don't see a second or a third shutdown of the economy next year. The other condition is that we see oil prices hanging in about where they're at, maybe even a little bit stronger. So for about the last 6 or 7 months, oil prices have been pretty consistent, actually, around $40 a barrel. Here I'm using the US benchmark price, the West Texas Intermediate. They've been pretty consistent. Our forecast for 2021 is that we see oil prices strengthen a little bit to maybe around $45 a barrel. So a modest improvement. We're not looking for it to go back to 100. But we do think as the global economy does pick up a little bit of momentum next year, hopefully on the back of a vaccine showing up, that we will see oil prices firming up a bit. And this is because of the significance of the energy sector in Alberta. If we were to see those oil prices slump back down to maybe $35 or $30 a barrel, again, there's no guarantees that could happen, then we would likely be revising downward that forecast. But for now, we are holding on to 3.3% as a forecasted expansion next year. The other headline numbers I want to share with you, and this is where the presentation actually gets kind of tough to talk about, the unemployment rate. I always say there's no economic indicator that gets to be more personal and emotional for people than indicators around the job market, for obvious reasons. Albertans, we don't toss and turn at night lying awake worrying about what GDP is going to be, or manufacturing shipments, or any of these other numbers that, as an economist, I might track. But Albertans will be anxious if they are fearful about their job. Are they going to lose their job? Are they going to find a job? Or maybe are there children coming out of university, or maybe students on the call tonight coming out of university? Are they going to find work? This is where the economy becomes very personal for people. And I understand that. But our forecast for 2020, we're expecting an average unemployment rate in Alberta, 11.4%. Now that is about 2.5 times higher than what Alberta traditionally enjoyed. And here I'm talking just previous to the 2015 oil price collapse. Alberta traditionally enjoyed an unemployment rate around 4.5%, maybe 5%, what would be called a balanced, healthy job market. 11.4% is far from balanced or healthy. And even worse, that 11.4%, it really understates the situation. 11.4% officially does not capture what we would describe as underemployed workers. Those might be people who technically they still have a job. They are on payroll somewhere, but they might not be working very many hours. They might be on furlough at home, hopefully collecting some sort of support income from perhaps the federal government, but basically they are not working to their income potential. They are underemployed. That 11.4% also does not capture what we would describe as discouraged workers. These would be workers who work in industries perhaps like tourism or accommodation, maybe certain positions in the energy industry, jobs that, at least for the moment, there just are really no possibilities available. So workers stop looking, at least for the time being. And if you quit looking for work, Statistics Canada actually doesn't even count you as unemployed. You have dropped out of the labor market. So 11.4% is the official rate, but I would estimate the effective rate or the practical rate of unemployment is probably closer to 20% once you add in the underemployed and discouraged workers. 20%, I think that number maybe connects with most of us intuitively. The idea that 1 in 5 Albertans has been negatively affected by the pandemic in terms of their job or their income. 2021, we're not even expecting that unemployment rate to fall very much, maybe to 11%. Now, you might question, well, if you're expecting some GDP growth to come back, does this mean it's going to be a jobless recovery? Not quite. We actually do expect some employment gains next year. The challenge is there are so many of those underemployed and discouraged workers that need to be absorbed back into the job market before we're going to start to see the unemployment rate fall by very much. So that's some tough news. 11.4% this year, not falling very much next year. I want to talk briefly about a few key industries in the province. We have to talk about the energy industry, of course, as always. I describe the energy industry as the dog that wags an awful lot of tails in Alberta, directly and indirectly, more so indirectly. But so much of what happens in the province's economy really depends on what happens in our traditional energy sector, our oil and gas producers. Now, the best description, or maybe the most optimistic description I would use for 2021 is stable. Maybe flat. Stable sounds a little bit better than flat, but we expect some stability in the energy industry, but it's stable at a very low level. In other words, we've seen years of contraction in terms of reductions in capital spending and capital programs in oil and gas. So it's stable, but at a pretty low level. We may still see some, I would expect to see some continued merger and acquisition activity in 2021, as those oil and gas producers, they're still looking for efficiencies. $45 oil is still not a great price. So they're still looking for more efficiencies. They're trying to get their productivity up, and merging and acquiring other companies is a good way to do that. But it does come at the cost of probably lost employment. So we're still expecting it to be a pretty tough year, with probably still more job losses, maybe especially here in Calgary, where you see a lot of those corporate head office jobs. But flat to stable, especially if we see oil prices stabilizing around $45 a barrel. So not a growth industry. However, there are 3 industries I want to highlight tonight that I do think represent maybe picking up the baton of growth from our traditional hydrocarbon producers. And these 3 industries are the ones I am more optimistic about. Number 1 of these industries, technology and digital sectors. Now, there's always been a lot of talk about the tech sector, and sometimes people ask me, how much does the tech sector contribute to the GDP of Alberta? Well, it's a little bit tricky and a little bit slippery to measure, in fact, because, and here I'm using air quotes with my fingers, but the tech sector is not really a sector at all, not in the way Statistics Canada measures a sector in its provincial accounts. It's not like energy or agriculture or retail, banking and finance. Tech is more infused throughout all of those different sectors. So it's sometimes a little bit tricky to get a good grasp on its contribution. But we do know that it is growing simply by the number of new tech companies we are seeing. and not just in Edmonton and Calgary, but in other centers and towns and cities across the province. There's been a lot of growth, a lot of it at the startup phase, but we are also seeing lots of examples of tech companies moving to Alberta. There is ample vacancy for office space, industrial space, lots of labor availability. So tech companies have both been starting up here in Alberta. They've also been moving to Alberta, and I think that will continue into 2021. One of the challenges with those tech sector jobs, and we have seen a lot of new job creation, but generally speaking, tech sector jobs, they just don't pay quite as handsomely as a lot of those traditional oil sector jobs. The oil and gas jobs in Alberta, by the way, on average, the highest paid employees in the country. So we've lost a lot of those very, very high paying jobs. The new tech sector jobs are good. They do provide some balance and some new opportunities and some diversity for the province. However, they aren't quite the same in terms of income as those energy sector jobs. So there is a little bit of challenge with that. However, we're still very welcome to see tech sector expanding because it does start to move the needle on diversifying and balancing our economy. The second sector where I have always been optimistic, and I think I remain even more optimistic for 2021, is agriculture and agri-foods. And I know, Lacombe, you're kind of right in the heart of it, of a lot of agriculture and agri-foods in the province. Traditional agriculture, and I've spent, by the way, my entire life in Alberta, so I didn't grow up on a farm, but I was never more than one generation or one family member away from farming in the province. Traditional agriculture, that makes up about 70% of farm cash receipts, and that's the big three: wheat, canola, cattle. Those three, if you can believe it, account for about 70%. Those have been around a long time. Generally speaking, they're pretty stable. Now, I would always be fearful standing in front of a room of farmers telling them just how good things are because I've had that misfortune, and any self-respecting farmer would take me out back and tell me a thing or two just about how difficult it is in farming. And you know, I really do not say that lightly at all. I have so much respect for our ag producers and our farmers. I always say this is not for the timid of spirit. You are never more than 2 hours away from absolute catastrophe in farming. So I don't say that lightly. It is a tough industry. However, 2020 was a pretty good year for farm cash receipts, especially those wheat and canola growers. Prices were generally pretty good, and most parts of the province, I don't guarantee every single part, but most parts of the province actually saw really nice growing conditions in the 2020 crop year. Nice, warm, dry conditions, ideal for harvest right past Thanksgiving. That really did give a nice boost to yield and to quality. So generally speaking, those traditional farm cash receipts, the wheat, canola, the cattle, generally pretty good shape in 2020. But where I'm more optimistic about growth is the other 30% of farm cash receipts that represent a growing and more diversified set of agricultural products. Here we're talking about things like cannabis. We're talking about pulses and beans and chickpeas. We're talking about vegetables, notably potatoes. We're talking about honey production. All of these things have been growing very, very strongly over the last 10 years, to the point where, in fact, when you look at manufacturing, now we can talk about agri-foods, which is the manufacturing sort of springboard from our agricultural products. This is where the value added is created. Food and beverage manufacturing has now surpassed refined petroleum in value and now represents the single largest, I guess, piece of the pie when you look at Alberta's manufacturing profile. So food and beverage has been growing very nicely right through COVID in 2020, I would say. In fact, COVID may have even given locally produced food and beverage a bit of a shot in the arm, because I guess for two reasons. I mean, some international trade in food and beverage was, I guess, disrupted or delayed in 2020. So we had to look more locally. But also, I think Albertans really do derive a benefit and some value in the pride in knowing they are supporting locally produced. Not once in my 25 years as being an economist have I seen so much emphasis on the shop local and support local movement. And I think that's really great. I mean, 2020 has been so difficult for so many people that I think consumers really do derive some satisfaction in knowing that their food purchasing is actually helping support somebody right in their local community, or maybe just down the road, or maybe in the next block over. A lot of the food and beverage manufacturing or food processing in Alberta, some of it is quite large scale. We think of the big meat packers in southern Alberta, or we think of the giant vegetable and potato processing plants in and around Lethbridge. But a lot of the rest of it has been quite small scale. And it's not to say that small scale hasn't made a contribution. Once you see 1,000 or more pinpoints of light, these small scale food and beverage processors, you really do start to see it move the needle again on diversity. So agriculture, especially agri-foods, and that 30% of new and growing crops and food products, I'm optimistic about in 2021. The third sector that I want to highlight, where I'm optimistic, is renewable energy and clean energy technology. Now, this too is not new to Alberta. It's been around for quite some time. In fact, Alberta's first wind farm, I was just reading about this, it actually started 27 years ago, if you can believe that. So wind energy for sure is not new, and Alberta is blessed enormously with wind and solar energy. And often when people think of renewable energy, they'll default to think about wind and solar. But where I'm more optimistic about some growth, I'm optimistic about wind and solar, but I'm even more optimistic about geothermal energy and hydrogen production. These are two new-ish areas for Alberta, but the provincial government has recently released some platform or some strategy papers around developing, more aggressively, developing geothermal and hydrogen. Geothermal, for a long time, I've been sort of urging the province to get behind. Now, some of the geophysicists and the geologists say, well, it's never going to work in Alberta. The geology is all wrong here for that. But in fact, it's really an engineering challenge. We all know that the heat of the Earth's crust is down there. In Alberta, you might need to get down a little bit further than you would, say, in Iceland or New Zealand, where geothermal energy is very near the surface of the Earth's crust. In Alberta, it is deeper, but we are the very best in the world when it comes to drilling through 2 kilometers of rock to get to something valuable. And there's more of value in the Earth's crust other than hydrocarbons. There's also heat. So I'm very pleased to see the provincial government getting behind a strategy to develop Alberta's geothermal resources, and the same with hydrogen. Now, hydrogen, there's been a lot of buzz around lately. Alberta has been a hydrogen producer for quite some time, although at relatively small scale. But not just Canada, but 27 countries around the world at the moment have strategies around developing hydrogen as a 100% carbon-free source of portable energy. So here we're talking about fueling transport vehicles with hydrogen rather than diesel. Now, there are some logistical problems, especially around developing a network of refueling stations and producing hydrogen, but Alberta has excellent hydrogen resource capacity. Well, we could become a world leader in producing and exporting hydrogen. We're early stages in this, but I am very happy to see some emphasis being put behind it. And in addition to the renewable or renewable energy, I'm also very optimistic about clean energy technologies. So these would be technological, or I guess tech company solutions to help our hydrocarbon producers reduce their carbon intensity or move towards net zero carbon emissions. This would be things like carbon capture and storage. And I know in Lacombe you're very close to the Alberta Carbon Pipeline, which goes roughly from east of Edmonton in the industrial heartland and kind of winds its way down and ends up close to Red Deer, I believe. So you're kind of on the path of it. Now, the idea with carbon capture and storage, and I certainly don't want to insult anybody on the call who might well know a lot more about this than I do, but the basic idea is if we can capture carbon from those big industrial emitters east of Edmonton, fertilizer plants and refineries, you capture that carbon right from the heat pipe or the exhaust pipes. You sequester it into the Earth's crust, and for every molecule of oil you can stick back into the ground, for every molecule of oil that you bring out of the ground in terms of a new barrel of oil, that barrel of oil is now carbon neutral. In other words, burning that oil leaves the Earth's atmosphere with no additional carbon because you've sequestered an equal amount. Alberta, we're already a leader in this technology. I think there's even more appetite and emphasis around it. And I think this is being led more by the business community, not by government regulations and government rules. I would say, 5 or 10 years ago, it was fair to say that when we talked about policies around renewable energy, around clean energy, carbon, reducing carbon emissions, it was often viewed as kind of a penalty, something we had to do, and there were going to be fines and there were going to be taxes if we emit carbon. And it was always viewed in the negative. Today, I really do believe the business community in Alberta, they are seeing this as the greatest economic opportunity that we have seen. So rather than viewing it as a penalty, they are seeing the benefits and opportunities, business opportunities in clean energy technologies. So those are the 3 areas I'm optimistic about: tech and the digital sector, agriculture and agri-foods, and renewable energy and clean energy technologies. Now what I want to do, and I've got to watch my time here, I want to transition back to the title of the presentation. What if it's easier than we think? I'm going to share with you tonight 3 stories that to me highlight that if our frame of mind is correct, adapting to change need not be as difficult as we think. The first story starts in Australia. This is a personal story. Last October of 2019, my family and I, we took a trip, which for me was a trip of a lifetime, to Australia. And this was a road trip, a 2,500 kilometer trip along the northeast coast of Australia, all along the Great Barrier Reef. Now, as many of you know, I'm sure many of you have been to Australia, it's just ridiculously beautiful. It almost, I often got angry at, just how beautiful a place Australia is. But you may also know that Australia is full of dangerous wildlife. And there are signs warning you everywhere you look. Beware of sharks. There are jellyfish that will sting you. There are spiders that will bite you, snakes that will poison you, crocodiles that will drag you to your death. At every turn, it seems there's something to be wary of. However, when I went to Australia, I was not scared or anxious about the sharks or the spiders or the crocodiles. I was, however, very nervous about one thing: driving on the left side of the road. This was a road trip, so I had to do some driving, and I thought, how am I going to be able to do this? I just could not in my brain visualize or imagine driving on the left with a steering wheel on the right side of the car and everything in reverse. So I was actually quite worried about how this was going to go down. But in fact, something amazing happened. When we picked up our rented SUV in the Brisbane airport, suddenly, you're kind of thrust into it. I had to take the wheel and start driving. But when I did start driving, I realized that it was not nearly as difficult as I thought it was going to be. And that proves this truism about human beings: we are amazingly adaptable when we need to be. Human beings, our default mode is the status quo. Naturally, none of us really like change all that much. Unless we're thrust into it, we kind of like things the way they are. We like the status quo. But when we are thrust into an environment that has changed on us entirely, we're actually way better at adapting than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. Now, I do have to note, driving in Australia, I don't want to suggest it was as easy as driving at home. It was not. I had to concentrate 100% of the time. There was no fiddling with the radio. There was no drinking coffee while I was driving. None of this. You had to focus on what's going on, especially in the cities. That said, it was not nearly as difficult as I thought it was going to be, and that's because as human beings, we're actually better at adapting than we think. That's the first story. The second story is more related to an economy. This one brings us to the United Kingdom, 1973 and 1974. The UK at the time was being rocked by the global energy crisis. Some of you might remember at the time, I was alive at the time, by the way, but I was watching Romper Room, so I wasn't paying too much attention. But the global economy was hit with the newly formed OPEC cartel, which was flexing its muscles, withholding oil supply, and driving petroleum prices through the roof. This was hitting the British economy very, very hard. At the same time, the British economy was hit with a coal miners' strike. And at the time, almost all electricity in Great Britain was coal-fired. So it was a double whammy for the Brits. Now, the British government, they took a couple of measures. They turned out every second street lamp to conserve electricity. They turned the heat and power down on public buildings. They even ended television broadcasting at 10:30 every night. But the most dramatic measure they took was this. They went from 5 days to a 3-day work week. This was a legislated, mandated reduction in work hours that affected every worker, every factory, every office worker, every shop or store in Great Britain had to reduce work hours by 40% to 3 days a week. That, along with the coal miners' strike, you could imagine this would represent quite a hit to the British economy. And you would think, sort of, back of the envelope calculation, you'd think, well, reducing hours of work by 40%, you would expect the economy would contract by 40%. But in fact, it didn't. It only contracted 10% in the first quarter of 1974. Now, what accounts for this? Well, British workers, turns out, were more adaptable under the circumstances than maybe we would have given them credit for. Here's a picture of some office workers working by lantern. But the point is that those workers, they did not have 6 months to prepare for this. This is where the comparison to COVID is a little bit similar. This was a very sudden and unexpected reduction in work hours. So it did represent a 40% shutdown of the economy. Again, with no warning, no advanced, there were no HR programs to help workers to transition. Suddenly, British workers were thrust into this, but output fell only by 10% because those workers instinctively became more flexible and adaptable. They became more productive. They increased their efficiencies, and they did this all without any notice. So it would not be correct to say that the British economy was not negatively affected. There was a 10% contraction, but it was not nearly the size of contraction that you would expect with a 40% reduction in work hours. My third and final story brings us back to Canada and a really interesting industry during an interesting period of time. This is bar and pub receipts in Canada for the first 10 years of this century. So this data goes from June 2000 to June 2010. These numbers are seasonally adjusted, and I should point out my left-hand margin there. It does not start at 0, so I should point that out. That is really just to exaggerate a little bit the movements going on here. But you see two distinct periods of time in this decade. The first 5 years of the decade, we see a nice steady increase in receipts, reaching an all-time record high in early 2005. But then, 2005 to 2008, you see this wild period of time with this shocking volatility month after month, these big spikes and drops in revenues at bars and pubs. Now, you might have already been guessing what was happening at this period of time. And there was something very specific. Between 2005 and 2008, Canadian provinces and municipalities were all gradually introducing no smoking bylaws in the bars and pubs. And this was having a wild impact on revenue. Now, a lot of the bar owners at the time were very fearful that if their patrons could not smoke in the bar, they were in fact going to stay home and never come home or never return to the bars. And they weren't kidding. They were very, very nervous about this. But in fact, what we see is a different story. Now, I'm not a smoker, so I don't know how they felt. I can't imagine the smokers were happy about it. But the smokers very quickly adapted to the new rules. They very quickly just adjusted to the idea that, well, if you want to have a cigarette, you have to go outside or step onto a designated area on a sidewalk somewhere. They adjusted to it with actually amazing speed. That very first spike down, you see that blue spike on the graph, the first one, that was Toronto, Canada's largest city and the first major municipality to introduce no smoking. And then you see the other spikes up and down as in a staggered way over time, other provinces and cities introduced no smoking bylaws. So these data tell me two things. One is that those smokers were more adaptable than we gave them credit for. But the other thing this graph tells me is that it would not be accurate to say that the no smoking bylaws didn't have any effect on those bars and pubs. They did have a big effect, a negative effect. It's just that the impact was not nearly as severe as what one might have expected. And that is because we are in fact more adaptable and flexible than we think. I'm going to end on this quote here. I love this quote. There's a failure to recognize that not only problems, but also solutions can grow exponentially. This is from a really interesting book, by the way. If you're looking for some good, positive COVID winter lockdown reading, I'd recommend this one. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. But I love this quote because it acknowledges there are problems. We don't stick our head in the sand. We don't pretend the problems don't exist. We don't, wish that they just ignore them and they'll go away. We have to acknowledge them. And in Alberta right now, there are problems and we do acknowledge them. But our focus needs to be on the solutions. And fortunately, these can also grow exponentially. I know there is a lot of talk. You'll hear people in Alberta say, even before COVID, you heard the sentiment by people saying, we need to get our economy back on track. You'd hear politicians say this and different people. And, I fully understand the sentiment in that. I really do. But if you think about that statement, we need to get back on track. That really is a statement rooted in nostalgia. It's rooted in backward-looking perspective. And you could argue that it was the track we were in around 2014. The track was the problem. We were a province far too dependent on one industry and one commodity within that industry. Then we saw it all unravel in 2015. Our province struggled for 5 years, then COVID. Now we're struggling even more with escalating problems. So we don't ignore them. But the solutions, they grow exponentially. And these are by looking to the industries that I outlined and by reorienting our frame of mind towards the solutions. It's sort of like driving in Australia. If I had only longed for the day when I can get back to the right-hand side of the road, I wouldn't have a very good vacation and I wouldn't have been a good driver in Australia. So rather than trying to get back to the right side of the road, I had to yield myself to the idea that the system here is different. And once you can mentally embrace that, then you find that adapting to change is not nearly as difficult as what you might think. With that, I want to thank you very much for your attention. I think I'm going to unshare my screen. I think I've taken up a little bit more time than allotted, but I'm happy if there are any questions or comments that people might have. This is the favorite part of the presentation for me.
Thank you very much. I'm inviting people, our guests, to either raise their hands when they have questions or to write the question in the chat. There are two ways. I think there are a few questions already, so I'm going to ask Danae if there's any question on the chat. You can read out to Todd.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Was it a question?
No, I'm inviting our guests to either raise their hand or to write the questions in the chat. All right, I see a hand, which is from Michael. Yes.
Thank you, Todd. Always great to hear from you, and your voice is an important one for our province, and always both a pragmatic and an optimistic perspective. I wonder if you might comment on the Biden presidency and its impact from the economic perspective at the ATB level and provincially, what you're anticipating. There's lots of talk, and of course the transition is now starting to take place and so on. There's a lot of negativity potentially around the oil and gas sector. In general, what do you see in terms of policy differences that are being signaled or foreshadowed by the Biden presidency?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I know there is a lot of anxiety in Alberta because President-elect Biden he campaigned on tearing up the Keystone XL pipeline, and we've been trying for 10 years in this province to get that project going. It's an important pipeline in terms of adding capacity for Alberta's heavy oil. President Trump was supportive of it, so I mean that is a tick in the positive column for Donald Trump. But I think it's a lonely tick in the positive column. But President-elect Biden says he's going to tear it up. So there is some anxiety about that. But you know, I don't think he is. My guess is he won't tear it up for this reason. He's also a pragmatic person. During a campaign, you say things to appease your base, and his electorate, a lot of it being environmentalists. And environmentalists, for reasons I've never really understood, the Keystone XL pipeline has become the whipping boy. It's a symbolic, we need to kill this pipeline. And Mr. Biden said, I'm going to kill the pipeline. But on his first day in office in January, he's going to be busy. He's got COVID to manage. He has a very divided American population. He has an economy in free fall. He's got China-US relations to start mending. I just can't see on any given day on his to-do list canceling the Keystone XL pipeline. He also has a very aggressive environmental platform, a lot of it around restrictions on fracking and on shale oil. This is actually helpful for Canada and for our producers, because one of the things that's been such a challenge over the last 4 years is that Donald Trump basically took a chainsaw to environmental regulations around oil and gas drilling. And the oil and gas industry cheered him on. But it actually made Canada relatively less attractive. And so we saw a big vacuum, a big sucking sound, pulling a lot of our energy, a lot of our capital, a lot of our people to places like the Permian Basin in Texas. That is now all going to come to an end. And I guess different people can have different debates about the environmental policies, but stricter policies around oil and gas extraction in the US are actually helpful for Canada. So I'm not really that worried about the Keystone pipeline. And even if he does tear it up, I think we can look forward to a more level playing field between Canada and the US, and probably even, higher oil and gas prices because of the stricter environmental regulations. So overall, I'm optimistic.
Thank you.
All right, Peter, I see another hand.
Thank you. Thanks, Todd, for this great presentation. The question I have kind of relates to the energy sector as well. So the short term, it looks very bad. I don't think we're going to see a lot of growth or a lot of changes happening there, but I do believe there's probably another 30-year time frame that we still need oil and gas. So in your opinion, can we see like an uptick, or like I won't even call it a boom, but like a positive kind of a development in that sector anytime soon?
Well, you're absolutely correct. We're going to be producing oil and gas for a long, long time in Alberta, probably longer than I'll be alive. So I'm not, I don't want to suggest oil and gas is a sunset industry, because we're going to be doing this for a long time. The difference is I don't see it being the growth engine of the province, not in the same way it used to be. I always describe, previous to, say, 2014, oil and gas, this was the growth engine. Today, it's taken on a different role. I would describe that new role as a backbone industry. Now, a backbone is also really important. I don't know if any of you suffer back pain. If you don't, you're too young, and you're going to find out what back pain is all about. But you'll understand you want to take care of your back, your core, your spine. So backbones are extremely important. Our energy industry is extremely important. And for decades to come, it will be. The difference is we cannot anticipate growth coming out of the energy industry, not to the same extent we used to in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and even in the 2000s. Yeah, we might see an occasional, burst in activity, maybe on strong prices. But more generally, I think we have to anticipate the energy sector being that backbone. The growth engine, now we have to move towards renewable and clean energy technologies, agriculture, agri-foods, and the tech sector.
Another question for you, Todd, is that I have a question from the room here. What is your analysis of the housing sector in the province?
Yeah, the housing sector is an interesting one. And in some ways, it's a little bit tricky to talk about because there's not just one market. There's probably, 300 identifiable real estate markets. Here where I live in the city of Calgary, there's probably, at least a dozen or more distinct markets. Generally speaking, though, real estate, residential real estate in Alberta, it's actually held up amazingly well through COVID. Far better than what you would expect with a 7% contraction in the economy and 11% unemployment. So why has it held up reasonably well? I think a couple of reasons. During COVID, we have not seen a mass out-migration of people. On a net basis, we have lost people to British Columbia. That is definitely true. But to the other 8 provinces, actually, we have not seen, on a net basis, a loss. So more people are, I think, just kind of sticking it out here. The idea being that, well, you could move, but there's not too many other places in the country where the economy is much better, not during COVID. So we haven't seen a mass outflow of people. Interest rates are at rock bottom. The 80% of people who are still working right through COVID, and maybe their income has not been disrupted, they might be seeing some real opportunities and very favorable mortgage rates, lots and lots of attractive properties on the market to pick from. So for a lot of people, it might have been actually a good time to get into real estate. All of that, I think, has supported real estate. It's not to say it's a great year, but it has not been this, price collapse or devastation that maybe we would have thought.
Okay. Any other questions in the chat? Anything in the chat room?
No questions in the chat, but just a comment saying it's nice how you looked at the positives and not dwelt on the negatives.
Okay. All right.
Well, I appreciate that comment.
Okay. I have read today, Todd, that the Dow reached 30,000 points. Can you comment on the fundamentals of it? Is it a bubble or anything? Is it real?
It really is quite amazing. With everything going on right now, the Dow Jones reaches an all-time record high, just now surpassing its previous record pre-COVID. I can't really explain it. I mean, I don't work on the investment side. So, following equity markets and all this prices, it's not really what I'm specialized in. But, you have to chalk it down to a few things. I think one is investors are cheered up these days by a couple things. One, I do think, even though people will have different opinions about, Donald Trump versus Joe Biden, I think generally speaking, markets are happy there is at least some certainty now. That there is, even if you don't agree with everything he might do, there is at least an adult to deal with in the White House. That was not the case, today it is still not the case. I won't say too much more about that. I guess the other thing that I think is cheering on investors, or maybe encouraging investors, is that interest rates are so low that in the bond market and that fixed income market, there's just no return to be made. I mean, so you can park your money in that, but you're not going to get any return from it. So I think that is encouraging more of those investors, even though they know it might come with more risks. It's sort of forcing that money to follow, bond or equities in the stock market. So I think that's what's going on. Now, if it's a bubble or not, I'm the wrong guy to comment on that. Bubbles always seem far more obvious after they burst. Hard to identify them usually when they're growing. And usually when they do burst, it's usually something very specific or something unusual that might trigger it. That again is obvious in hindsight, but difficult to see before it happens. So I don't want to predict if there's a bubble building. I certainly can't be giving anybody investment advice, but I would agree that, stock market's at a record high right at this moment in time. Oh, and I guess the other thing that is providing some optimism is the encouraging news around the development of a vaccine. I think that has to cheer some investors up.
So I have a question in the chat. How do you see the financial industry stepping up to the plate?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I guess since I work in the financial industry, I should have an answer. I can't speak for every bank and credit union. I mean, all of them have different strategies, but I can speak from the conversations we're having here at ATB Financial. I'm going to be honest, COVID has been a tough year for ATB, just like it's been tough for every single Albertan. This did not go to plan as we were sorting out our 10-year strategy, it's sort of in the middle of last year. We did not anticipate a global pandemic. So it's thrown us kind of on our back heel, and we've had to make adjustments. But through all of it, there's one thing we know as a financial institution, and that is we've been in Alberta for 80-some years. We have been through Alberta through thick and thin. This is a little thinner than normal in COVID in terms of economic catastrophe. But we're here to support Albertans in whatever ways we can. It doesn't mean that the answer is always going to be yes, but we really do feel strongly that ATB Financial has a role to help support small business, help support diversifying Alberta's economy, especially around those sectors I've identified. So, I mean, I don't want to make that sound too much of a rah-rah for ATB, but I think overall, financial industry, whatever we can do to support Alberta businesses, that's what ATB is here for.
Okay.
You see government regulation needing to change to spur evolution and growth?
Yeah, that's a good question. In Canada, we have a bit of a default to say, when there's problems, the government needs to do something. And I know not everyone believes that. Some people believe the government should just get out of the way and let the market do whatever. I really am of the belief that we give, at least in terms of the economy, I don't want to get into the pandemic and the measures that the government is taking around the health pandemic, because I do think that is something very, very specific. But in terms of, ignore COVID for the time being, in terms of economic policy, I really believe we give governments both too much credit and too much blame for what's going on. And it's really easy for governments and opposition in government to, be critical and say, well, it's all because of this policy, or for governments to say everything good is because of our policies. I don't think the government deserves as much credit and blame as they get. I think economic policies can help. They can support the groundwork, or maybe, what's the metaphor? Create the best growing conditions, but ultimately an economy has to grow on its own. So I think government policies can be helpful, but I always caution us, let's not put too much emphasis and too much hopes and prayers, and we just need the government to institute the right policy. And until they do that, there's nothing we can do. I think that's a wrong way to think about government and its involvement in the economy.
Okay.
maybe the very last question, if there is your last question, is time. We're going to end in a few seconds. But the last question: do you anticipate any external shock that could upset the numbers you forecasted for 2021?
Oh, there's no end of shocks that could happen. 2020 has been full of shocks. I guess the biggest positive shock might be that, in fact, the vaccine rollout turns out to be more effective and the rollout more widespread, in fact, faster than we thought. I'm not putting a lot of money on that sort of proposition, but that could be one unforeseeable positive shock. A negative shock, I guess, is just the reverse of that, that in fact the vaccine, maybe some of the trials the upcoming trials aren't as successful. Maybe Health Canada does delay it for, proper reasons, but, if that vaccine rollout does not come until, say, 2022, we'd be revising downward. I do think everything is kind of in suspended animation when it comes to COVID, until we can see that light at the end of the tunnel, being the vaccine widely available.
Okay. Thank you very much. That was all the time we had. Is there one more question?
Oh, is there one more question?
Yes, there was. Where do you see the population in Alberta in 10 years?
10 years. It's interesting because even in the last year, Alberta's economy has been most severely impacted by COVID, but we fell in ranking the population, or ranking the provinces in population growth. We fell from number 1 to number 2. And that is largely because of natural population growth, births minus deaths. We're still popping out a lot of babies. That has to do with our average age being younger here in Alberta. So even during, a pandemic, our population continues to grow. So right now we're 4.7 million people. 10 years from now, I'm going to say we're 6.1, because I think Alberta is going to continue to grow despite the current economic challenges. I remain optimistic about our ability in the province to adapt to changing economic and health pandemic conditions. And as a result, I'm optimistic about the province and about growth. So that might be a really good note to end on.
Okay. Mr. Hirsch, thank you. The School of Business at Birmingham University, thank you very, very much for that tremendous speech. And when I announced that you were coming to speak, I said you are one of the brightest economic minds in the province, or even in the country. It was a pleasure for us to have you, and we hope that in the future, when you have time, we can see you again right here. We do enjoy your presentation today, and on behalf of the university and the School of Business, I thank you very much. So we're going to end the official recording now. I don't know if you have a couple of minutes, people who would stick around and chat. But
absolutely. And I just wanted to thank you for having me tonight. It's been a real honor. I wish everyone a great evening and a great rest of 2020. And we can all look forward to brighter days in 2021.
Again, thank you very much.
And I'm happy to stick around for a bit.
Thank you.